take one. The CD's in there. Feel free to take one of the books. But in this journey that we've been making from ashes to fire, we have been with Jesus in the desert. We have sat with him on the ledge of a well. We've even walked the dusty roads with him. We have listened in on some very interesting conversations. One conversation he had with Satan. One conversation he had with a woman who didn't have the best of reputations. And last week we listened to his conversation with a blind man. But this morning, I mean, this is just unbelievable. This is unfathomable. We've been with Jesus in the desert. We've been with him at a well. We've been with him on the road. Now we're with Jesus in a cemetery. And in a moment, we're going to listen in to a very brief conversation Jesus has with a corpse, with a dead man. But you know, this whole scene, as we look at Jesus in the cemetery, it kind of reminds me of an Old Testament story that is a little personal, has some personal interest to me. It's the story of Ezekiel. There's a reason we named our boys what we did, and Ezekiel has a very special meaning to us. It's one of my favorite stories, and if you remember in Ezekiel's story, he has a vision. When God somehow took Ezekiel to what was a cemetery. We'll call it Dry Bones Acres, okay? Ezekiel was confronted in that moment with a question from God. The question that, at least on the surface, you know, every time I see that story, read that story, I want to say, shouldn't Ezekiel have been asking this question? But God takes Ezekiel, and he sees all these bones lying all around, and he says to Ezekiel, you tell me something. Can these bones live? I mean, I place myself in that story. I told you last week I love to put myself in the story of Scripture and imagine being there and imagine what it would be like to be the guy that God says, okay, I want you to go to this cemetery. I want you to go where all these skeleton bones are laying, and I want you to preach to them. Okay, that sounds like a lot of fun. Yeah, I've read quite a bit of stuff about John Wesley and his ministry. And I remember reading this story about how Wesley one time went out and was in a pasture and ended up preaching to hundreds and hundreds of cattle and wasn't sure whether any were converted. I would take cattle over skeletons. It's just, me. But God says, I want you to go and I want you to preach in this valley of dry bones. I want you to preach to these skeletons. But here's a question I want you to keep in mind, Ezekiel. Can these bones live? And Ezekiel says, really, about the only thing that we can, the only response that there is, proper response to God is, only you know. Now, if you remember, Ezekiel watched as these bones began to come together. I mean, it's just fascinating. If you kind of, I wish Hollywood would pick up on this one, because it's a fascinating story. If you imagine, all the bones start coming together, and they come together right. It's not like a whole bunch of femurs come together to make one huge femur bone. All the bones come together right, and they begin to form full skeletons. And then Scripture says they get covered with muscles, and they're covered with tendons, and they're covered with sinews, and finally flesh comes over these things. But there's a problem. There's still no life. The valley of dry bones has now become the valley of the living dead, or the valley of zombies. I've been fascinated by the interest that there is in zombies now. There's TV shows, there's movies, there's games, all this stuff about zombies. I saw some kid on Facebook the other day, a friend of one of my boys, said, okay, when the zombie apocalypse comes, here's what we're going to use. I'm going, are you, really? Really? You're planning for the zombie apocalypse? Well, that's kind of what Ezekiel was faced with. He's faced with these bodies with no life. And you see, God asked him this question, can these bones live? And Ezekiel says, only you know. And the reality is, only God can make them live. The only way that those dry bones could live was for God to breathe life into them. The same revelation, the same mighty wind of Pentecost. Now, keep that scene in mind. Fast forward to our text. It's a very similar setting. Here's Jesus, like Ezekiel, standing in the middle of a cemetery. Now, I want us to back up for just a moment to really understand, to get an idea of what's really happening here. Jesus had escaped Jerusalem, just as he did last week, amidst quite a bit of controversy. And he went beyond the Jordan to where John had earlier been baptizing, and word comes to Jesus that Lazarus was sick. Now, here's what we really need to understand. I know we've talked about this before, but I want you to really keep this in mind. Lazarus was not just an acquaintance of Jesus. Lazarus was not just a Facebook friend. I'm constantly, Zeke's always coming to me and going, Dad, guess how many friends I have on Facebook now? I had 600 and whatever friends. You only have 200, Dad. I said, let me tell you something. Here's the difference. Everybody I have as a Facebook friend, I've actually sat and talked to. Most of these people you call your friends, you wouldn't know them on the street if you saw. I would too. I've talked to everyone. Okay. Yeah, you live with that fantasy. Lazarus wasn't a Facebook friend. He wasn't just an acquaintance of Jesus. This was not some guy that Jesus had just walked by one time and said, hi, it's nice to meet you, and kept right on moving. This was a good friend. Jesus has visited in Lazarus and his sister's home often. It was almost, in a sense, we could almost consider it Jesus' retreat center. It was where Jesus went when he needed to relax and unwind. When Jesus needed a cup of hot coffee and a comfortable lazy boy, that's where Jesus went, to Lazarus' home. This was a very special relationship that Jesus and Lazarus and his sisters had. In fact, John tells us that it was Lazarus' sister, Mary, who took the expensive perfume and anointed Jesus' feet and wiped them with her hair. That's a special relationship. They were close friends. And so we would expect, okay, I want you to pretend for just a moment that you don't know the rest of the story, okay? You're not Paul Harvey. You don't know the rest of it. I want you to pretend for a moment that you're hearing the story for the first time. When Jesus gets word that one of his best friends is sick, what would we expect him to do? Go. Immediately go to see Lazarus. I mean, after all, Jesus had healed a lot of people that he didn't even know. Surely he would drop everything, especially because there's all this controversy surrounding. Surely he'd drop everything, go to this place where he knows it would be safe, and be with Lazarus. I mean, that's what he's going to do, right? No. Instead, Jesus intentionally stayed where he was for 2 more days. Then he decided, okay, we'll go back. Now keep in mind, Jesus and his disciples are about to head back into a place that wanted Jesus dead. That's why Thomas says, okay, look, we're going to go with you, but we're going to go with you to die. And so we could understand if Jesus didn't go back at all because out of fear, but to wait 2 days and then say, okay, we'll go back. I mean, all that 2 days did was to give Lazarus time to die, which is what happened. Now, there are places on this journey in this story that we could stop with Jesus and learn something. We could stop with Jesus when he wept. I got to tell you, John 11 has one of the most gracious, grace-filled verses that there is in all of Scripture, and it's 2 words. Jesus wept. Saying to us that Jesus identifies with us, that there's not a thing in our lives that touches our hearts, that brings us pain, that has not first touched the heart of God. And there are some times that the only comfort we find is found in the fact that Jesus puts his arms around us, just like he did with Mary and Martha, and weeps. Just weeps. We could learn in this story that when we hurt, God and Jesus Christ hurts with us, that when we weep, he weeps with us. We could stop and consider why Scripture tells us a couple of times that Jesus got angry. We don't have a lot of places where we learn that Jesus got angry, but we do twice in this passage read that Jesus became angry. The other time he got angry was when he turned the tables over. Remember that whole story? Twice in this story, we're told that he was angry. Could it be that he was angry when he stood there face to face with the punishment that he never wanted us to face, which was death? It could be. Could it be that he was angry because he was standing there face to face with the punishment that he was about to endure for us? Maybe. Some time ago, I read that part of the reason, one commentator proposed that maybe one of the reasons that Jesus cried, that Jesus wept at this time, was because he realized what it was he was bringing Lazarus back from. I mean, he'd been there. He left all of heaven to come be with us. Now Lazarus is there with God, and Jesus is going to bring him back to this. Maybe that's why he wept. I don't know. We don't have any scriptural basis for that. But there could be some truth in that. And maybe that's why he was angry. We could learn that at least part of the reason that Jesus called Lazarus by name is because Jesus has such power over death, such power over the tomb, that if Jesus would have just said, okay, come forth, that all of the tombs would have emptied. So he just said, okay, Lazarus, you're the one I'm calling, so you come out. We could stop at all those places, but we're not going to. Here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to listen to Jesus' conversation with Lazarus' sister Martha. We can understand Martha was upset. Let's just be honest. Martha was angry. She was ticked off. I thought Jesus was a friend. Where is he? I mean, suddenly, as she's thinking all this, suddenly word comes to her that there's kind of a familiar silhouette out on the horizon, and they begin to recognize it's Jesus. And so they run to Martha and they say, hey, look, Jesus is coming. And before the words can finish falling out of the air, Martha runs out to meet Jesus, and we can hear the emotion in her voice. If only you'd been here. A few weeks ago, we looked at the disciples in the boat with Jesus when the storm came on and Jesus was sound asleep. It's kind of that same emotion. Jesus, why now? I mean, we sent word days ago that Lazarus is sick, and now when you finally get here, not only is he dead, but he's been in the tomb for 4 days. I mean, they get pretty graphic here. He's been in the tomb 4 days. He's going to stink already. That's how long he's been dead. Jesus, there's nothing you can do now. I mean, it's almost pointless that you've come at this point. Now I understand that none of your versions record the scene that way, and the original language doesn't record it exactly that way either, but you can kind of place yourself in Martha's sandals and understand those feelings, right? I mean, wouldn't you have been hurt? Wouldn't you have been angry? Disappointed? I would have been. And probably feeling somewhat hopeless. There's nothing that can change at this point, nothing he can do now. Jesus, if only you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And then it was almost as if Martha realized what she was saying, and more importantly, kind of realized who she was talking to. And she said, but Jesus, even now, I know God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus says, yep, your brother will rise again. You know, we have been kind of conditioned to give kind of pre-scripted pat answers at difficult times.